Welcome to July, everyone. And before we get to the podcast, I want to remind everyone about my Patreon page. For as little as $1 a month, you can support the podcast. For as little as $5 a month, you can get unedited videos of conversations with many of my guests. There is also an option to join for free. You can check it out for 30 days, and currently about a dozen of my listeners are doing exactly that. The following are members of my Patreon group, and I want to give them a shout out and say thank you so much for your continued support. Sending love to Sean Poole, David and Jennifer Von Evers, Jeff Ulmer, Sylvan Groth, Liz Brunson, Yetta, Steve Anzac, Randy Floyd, Rob Barnett, Bella Pori, John Munson, Betsy Hodges, Levi Petrie, Stephen Malio, Steve Rogers, Dale Hosack, Terry Smith, and Chris Bloom. During the summer, the amount of people listening to podcasts normally shrinks. Downloads go down, and this summer with Bruce touring, I know a lot of people's time and money is going toward hearing and attending Bruce's shows. Who can blame them? But I want to thank you for taking time during this summer listening to this podcast. And thank you to everyone who goes to patreon.com, Set Lusting Bruce, and checks it out. Okay, enough PBS dribble. Now let's go to the episode and listen to what's hopefully an entertaining conversation. Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brand new episode of Set Lusting Bruce, your podcast all about Bruce Springsteen, his music, and mostly his fans. I am your host, Jesse Jackson. We're getting off the Bruce train tonight, even though I'm sure he will come up, and we are going to talk about life, love, and legacy. Lori Tucker Sullivan, welcome to Set Lusting Bruce.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here with you, Jesse.
Tell us a little about yourself.
So I am a writer, educator living in Detroit, city, of course, steeped in music, and have been here for several years, born and raised in the city, went away for a while through college and then married life, but returned a few years ago and really enjoy being a part of the city. I have recently released my first book, which is called I Can't Remember If I Cried, Rock Widows on Life, Love, and Legacy. And in that book, I tracked down, sought out the widows of rock stars, many of whom died young or left young widows, and met with them, got their stories, which are pretty amazing, and then learned from them about grief. Really, the book is about those women and their journeys and their stories, but also what they taught me about grief and how they helped me on my own grief journey. Growing up in Detroit, of course, music was everywhere, and it was always my hope from a young age to be a music writer. And then I took this other path, got married, we renovated an old house, I had a family. And then I lost my husband in 2010 after a 2-year battle with cancer. And so I looked at how I might return to writing, come full circle. And really, this book has allowed me to do that. I was able to interview the widows of many of the men I would have interviewed had I stayed in music writing. So I was able to learn about them, but through the lens of these women who love them. And it's really been an extraordinary experience. And now I'm out promoting the book. So happy to be here.
I am so thrilled you are. We're going to get to the book in a minute, but I always like to start at the beginning. You talked about growing up. Was there a lot of music in your household when you were growing up? What were your parents listening to?
My parents were older. My parents were actually in their late 30s when I was born. I think my mom always called me the miracle, and my brother and sisters called me the accident. So, whichever it was, here I am.
Depending your perspective, right?
Yes. But music was certainly a big part of our lives growing up. And my parents, not so much, but they tolerated their kids' love of music. And for me, having older siblings really introduced me to music at a pretty young age. I think I bought my first record when I was maybe 11 years old. That was Carole King's Tapestry album, which I still have, and all sorts of music and concerts. Live music was a very big part of growing up in Detroit. I think we probably went to a live show maybe every 2 weeks, and ticket prices were $5 also, which didn't hurt. But we had Cobo Arena, we had Ford Auditorium. There were several shows there. We had Masonic Temple. I've seen some really wonderful people at bars. Once saw REM, I believe, at a bar or a very small stadium, or not a stadium, but a very small location. And it's just music here is just so accessible. And certainly in the 70s and 80s, it was. And of course, Motown, there's just no escaping the deep roots that Detroit has in music. Lucky to be here.
It's interesting. I've been doing this for a while, and there are themes I see, and siblings often play a big part of our discussions. Often people will have their parents who love music, or they grew up enjoying their parents' music or rebelling against their music. But often what comes up is my was an older sibling, therefore I influenced my younger siblings, or I was a younger sibling and I was influenced by my older. Sometimes they rebel. My older sibling was in classic rock, so I went more toward grunge or jazz. So very cool. The By the way, I think we could do a whole episode on just Carole King and Tapestry, and just
Yes.
how I can remember that album being so huge, and it's just a modern classic. It really is.
Yes,
So
it
yeah,
really is.
that's a really good, that's something you can hang my first was pretty solid coming
Yes.
right out
Yeah.
of the
Yeah.
gate.
Pretty foundational piece of music, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. As you grew up, you were talking about you wanted to be a music writer. Who were some people who influenced you? And let's talk a little bit about that. Why, what you thought when you wanted to grow up, that's what you wanted to be.
Again, Detroit, home of Cream magazine. There were
Yeah,
multiple times when I popped into the offices and shared clips that I had written for my college newspaper. And it was a kind of rough time. That was mid 80s, a little bit of a rough time, rough patch for Cream at that point. But certainly I had female music writers as examples. Susan Whitall, Jan Uhalski. There aren't many places where you can grow up with heroes like that, female heroes like that right there. So yeah, I had close friends growing up, and I think I was always the writer in the group. They were more visual art and things like that, but I was always the one that kind of walked away and went to write in my journal or wrote really bad poetry. Or so I have always wanted to be a writer, and I was hoping to combine those two loves of music and writing.
so I often ask people who are writers, were you a big reader growing up? Was the family a big reader?
I would, in the family, not quite so much, but I was definitely a big reader. Trips to the library and lots of books coming home and hanging out in the backyard in the summer reading. So yeah, always been a big reader. And I spent several years as part of my career in working for independent bookstores. So I've been steeped in publishing, book selling for many years. I teach now, and so I'm no longer working for that organization, but have always had a real affinity for books and the whole kind of industry of book publishing, book selling, all of those things, and not an easy thing to do these days. So,
Sure.
but very
Did
important.
did you talked about growing up, and were did you at least stay part of a writing? Did you find a way to use your creative in your career, even though you had not written a book yet?
A little bit. It was very interesting. So I ended up right around the same time that I thought I'm not really made for this music writing job. I'm not going to push my way into a backstage setting or something like that. It really was a kind of reflection that maybe this wasn't the best place for me to be, or I wasn't cut out for that type of work. And at the same time as that, I met my future husband. And so he was there to tell me that I could find other ways to use writing. So I worked for the most part prior to the bookstore position. I did work for a newspaper. I worked in PR and marketing and did a lot of writing in that area. But there was always something missing in my life. And it took several years to come back to the idea that it was writing, that I really wanted to write full time. And so right around 2007, I had the big discussion that I need to be doing this full time. I had some interest actually from an agent for a book that I had started that was about family history. And so I said, I need to do this. I need to write this book and I need to go back to school in order to do that. So I went back to get my MFA and made it through the first semester. And then my husband was diagnosed in 2008 with an aggressive form of cancer, head and neck cancer. And so I finished out the second semester, but then put everything on hold to try to get through that diagnosis. So I had come to this realization that I really wanted to try to write full time. I thought I had at least one book in me. It was a very different book than this one, but that kind of got put on hold. And then after he passed away, he made me promise before he passed away that I would go back to school and finish my degree. I was very close at that point. So I did. And I was on my way to class one day when I heard a story about Yoko Ono. And I thought, I have a very different feeling toward her, a very different attitude now toward her than I did before, because I think of her as a fellow widow. And I look at all that she has accomplished in terms of John Lennon's legacy, raising their son, doing her own music and pursuing her own art, all of these things. Like she became a kind of hero for me at that point. And then I started thinking that there must be more of these women out there that had lost their musician husband at a young age and had gone on to do maybe just to get by or maybe to do some really wonderful things. And so it was actually, there was a group of us that went out after class that night, and I took my laptop and looked them up and came up with a list of, I think I had maybe 11 or 12 at that point who qualified, but also had had led interesting lives. And so I really thought, I'm onto something here. And at that point, I made it into a project. I wanted to meet them. I started writing letters, reaching out on social media, and really just for my own kind of edification to meet them, talk with them. And I took notes, I recorded our interviews, and thought there might be something there, either a series or something that could run in a magazine. I wasn't quite sure. And then eventually the idea became a book. So then I started pitching the book and had to find a publisher and all of that. But it
So
really came out of this need to return to writing and being on that path and then thinking about Yoko.
2017, I was on and off having end of 2016, beginning of 2017, I was having really severe stomach pains, and then they'd go away. And like they often say, what's a scale 1 to 10? And I would say this was 8, 9, or a 10. And I went to the doctor, like, we think it's this, or we think it's that, or we think it's this. And finally, it was in March, and it was just really bad. And my family doctor said, go to the emergency room. So we went to the emergency room, and they said, we think you have a tumor. And the next day, we think it's cancerous. And the third day, yes, you have colon cancer. And so I'm in the hospital, and Linda, who's my wife, and I, because she's incredibly worried about me, I'm incredibly worried, we have a fight, right? And she leaves. Like, I've got to go. And I'm like, yes, you do. And then the cardiologist came in and said, hey, you didn't pass your stress test. I'm going to have to do it a different one, but I don't know if you're healthy enough for surgery. And my sister was there. She said, I said, I think I want to be alone. So I pulled up my phone and I made an F cancer playlist. So this is where I'm going. And I started throwing Bruce songs in there and Beach Boy songs and songs that meant a lot to me of hope and everything. And I kept that list. And after surgery and every chemo trip, I did not listen to a podcast. I did not watch online. I just closed my eyes as that poison's going into my body and listened to this F cancer playlist. Now, my audience is going, why the hell are you telling this story, Sorry, Jesse? But when I went to Amazon and it said, read an excerpt from the book, you start out telling about your husband being diagnosed and how you guys develop different playlists.
Mm-hmm.
And if I wasn't excited about interviewing before, after reading that, I said, oh, it's my people.
Yes.
So with that long-winded question, would you mind telling me a little bit more about that? And then I'd love to know what some of the songs were.
Oh gosh, I don't know if I can remember too
That's okay.
many of the songs. I can cheat and look it up because it's one of my playlists now.
Yeah.
But he went through 3 rounds of treatment, and the last he was stage 4 at that point. And so none of them were easy, but certainly the last ones were quite difficult. And I will say that those playlists really got him through that time. And it can be hopeful, and it can get you charged up, or it can also just bring you some peace. And I think that depending on the time, that's what happened. One of the songs I know, I'll tell you 2 quick stories, but one of them was Warren Zevon's cover version of Knocking on Heaven's Door. And people, when he posted the playlist and asked our friends to send their suggestions, they all asked about, do you really want this song on there? And not just because it was a song about dying, but Zevon's version was very powerful. He was dying when he recorded it. And Kevin said, yes, I need that song too. I need to grapple with what that song brings up. As much as listening to just happy music, it was important for him to have that one as well. A song that really brought him great peace, that he loved, that we played at his memorial service, was Shambhala by Three Dog Night.
Wash away my trouble, wash away my pain with the rain and Shambhala. Wash away my sorrow, wash away my shame with the rain and Shambhala. Everyone is lucky, everyone is kind. Long the road to Shambhala. Everyone is happy, everyone is so kind. On the road to Shambhala.
And that song still is difficult for me to listen to. And friends will reach out. They'll send me a text when they hear it on the radio. Or I was just looking at a Facebook post memory from a couple years ago, just the other day, but from a few years ago, where I was going out to visit my sister. And as I got in the car, I was thinking, gosh, this is a beautiful day, and I'm going out to see them on the lake. And Kevin would really love going with all of us, going out there and gathering together at this really cool place on this beautiful lake, and wish he was here. And then Shambhala came on the radio, and I thought, there he is. He's letting me know that he'll be with us today. And I got to my sister's house, and we were talking. She showed me around. It was a new house. They had just moved in. And we got back into the kitchen, and she said, oh, I turned on the Sirius on my speaker just a little while ago, and guess what song was on? It was Shambhala. And so we had, at the very same moment, two people who were 40 miles apart tuned into the same radio station at the same exact moment and listened to that song. And I think that's pretty cool. Whenever I hear that song, there's been something on my mind, or I've just been thinking about him, or it just comes on at the most opportune times. And I wonder, how did that DJ know, to play this song at that moment? But yeah, so those are two songs. When I started putting together a list of the women that I wanted to interview, Warren Zevon was early on. Crystal Zevon, his widow, went on the list pretty quickly. I really wanted to focus on musicians that we both really enjoyed.
Yeah.
So James Honeyman Scott from the Pretenders, but there are others, some who said no. Kevin's favorite band of all time was The Clash. On our, I think, third or fourth date, we went to a Clash concert. So they were always very important to us. Joe Strummer's widow declined to be interviewed, and that happened. I just kept going on. But so that was how I formed the initial list, was musicians that were important to us.
One of the Warren Zevon songs that My Ride's Here, and Bruce did a cover of that.
Yes.
And then Keep Me in Your Heart is one of my favorite songs by Warren.
Yeah.
In fact, that whole album that he did when he knew he was passing is a powerful album.
It really is. It's an extraordinary album.
Yeah, that's neat. So you talked a little about this, but I'd like to dwell a little more. So and partly this is, by the way, my wife says every time a wind chime blows that it's her mother saying hi. So maybe that's your husband saying hi.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
saying that I'm
like
here.
to think so. Right.
Yeah, I think so too. Yeah, and I will think of that now anytime I hear that song. So you're on a quest. You are honoring your husband's legacy by saying, Lori, I want you to finish your school. I want you to live your dreams as if I was by your side. And you're also going, this is a good way maybe by working through my grief. If I talk to other people that have gone through similar things, and on a less serious note, when we had our son, Chris, I made a joke when he was 2 or 3 that I could be in any room with any famous person, and as long as they had a kid, we could talk, because whether you're a rock star, a president of the US, Queen of England, we're going to talk about how your children bring you joy and frustrate the crap out of you, right? So you have this common language of I've lost my life partner and you've lost your life partner. And even though the experiences are different, there is a similarity.
Yes.
So I guess the question is, was this subconscious in your mind, or did you think, yeah, this is a way for me to deal with my grief journey?
It was definitely that I wanted to talk with them about the grief journey. I was very surprised that it had never been done before, that there wasn't a book like this out there. That still surprises me. And when I started reading their stories, I just felt that they were amazing stories. They've done really amazing things. And then to start talking with some of them, to find out that we do have this loss in common and we have the grief in common, but they've been through so many things that I'll never experience, because of the fame, because of the music business and all that entails, because of fans, because of managers, record companies. They have just dealt with things that I'll never deal with. But I wanted those stories out there. Once I started talking to them, I thought I need to really chronicle these life histories. And they also had stories about their partners or husbands that we had never heard, that, like, how did we not go to the women who were closest
Yeah.
to them and say, tell us all about him now that he's gone. We want to know. And, people are surprised that women reached out to me, that I would send off a letter to Gretchen Parsons Carpenter, who had such a difficult experience with Graham, but she wanted to talk. She wanted to tell that story, and no one had ever asked her. They'd passed judgment on her many times, but they had not asked her for her story. And so once I started reading and then talking with them, I really felt this sense of purpose. And that, I think, is the kind of the greatest gift that this whole project has been for me, is that it has really given me this new sense of purpose. Around the time of Kevin's passing, I also lost both of my parents, my dad the year before, my mom a year and a half after. We had a minister of our church who really walked us through this whole time of Kevin's illness and death, and she passed away. We lost multiple close friends. I had to sell the house that we had purchased as newlyweds, and my kids went off to college. So really all the ways in which I identified myself were washed away within about a 4 or 5 year period. So the idea of re-identification or finding a new purpose and a new identity was really intriguing to me. And I think all of these women have had to do that because they were so closely identified with this man. They lived in his shadow for the most part, and then they came out from that shadow afterwards. And so that was very intriguing to me. And I think it's a big part of the book and really a great part of their stories.
One of the things I'm thinking as you were talking is that their grief can be personal, but it's also the world is sharing that grief.
It's
And
very public.
and I thought of many years ago, but I remember a sports writer talking about that when Michael Jordan quit basketball and went and played played baseball, minor league baseball. And a lot of people are like, why? And he talked about that. Michael said that he felt close to his father when he was playing baseball. And this struck me. He says, news cycle happens so fast that we move on very quickly, but it really had not been that long since he'd lost his father.
Yeah.
And it is your grief is there is as when my wife lost her dad and then her mom, and I've lost my father and stepfather. And as I'm recording this, we got word today that my mom's in hospice and they aren't sure how much longer she's going to last. There becomes a new normal. It things will never be the same, but it's a new normal. And things move so fast, and you go, it's only been a year. I've only lost blank 2 years ago.
Right.
And so you've already mentioned one person, so I'm not going to dwell on people who didn't end up talking to you, but is there a couple people you stood out that you went, wow, this was a really big get? Like, okay, I'm shooting for the moon and I ended up hitting it.
I don't think I can rank any,
Okay,
like
I
all of them.
understand that. Yes,
And
all of them were
all of
just right.
them,
Makes
like
sense.
if I sent out a note on the first one that I spoke with is also the first chapter in the book, Gloria Jones. And I sent off a note on her Facebook page and did not expect to hear back from her. And I get a call from her in Sierra Leone, where she is living at that time, running the Mark Bolan School of Music and Film. And her whole story is just so amazing. And she said, I'm going to be in LA in 2 weeks. Meet me. And I said, yes, I will. I made plans and went out there, and she met me on Sunset, grabbed my hand, and we went to the Rainbow Room and the Troubadour. And she told me all about this rock and roll excess life in the 70s with Mark and their friends, Harry Nilsson and John Lennon, and all of the people who were around at that time. And so then I just knew that this was that these stories were really amazing. And so it was a big get, really spoken to anybody. And now even more so because of the work she has done to preserve Mark's legacy. He and T-Rex are in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and there have been a couple really wonderful documentary films about him. And so that was very important. I think it was an important discussion with her. I'll bring up Gretchen Parsons Carpenter again. She's spoken very little about the time with and then immediately after Graham's passing. I think, without talking too much, read the book. The narrative around their last days together was really taken from her, the ability to claim that narrative and write that narrative. And I think she reclaims it a little bit in this book by giving her story. And that kind of put me then on that path of how many women are there who really completely lost the ability to write the narrative around their relationships. And almost all of them have. That story has been written by others. And that's not cool in my book.
So yeah, and I was going to ask that. I'm making a note that I'll come back and ask you something else. But you mentioning that, are there, as you're starting to write this book, are there themes you're seeing that as you start telling the stories that you're weaving in? While everyone is unique, there is some, I talked about siblings when I talk about this, right? There's certain things. Were you seeing some?
Sure.
Close, please.
Yes, yes. One of the first things that I noticed that really hit me was how young so many of these people were, early 20s, and having to deal with some really difficult situations, not just the death and the aftermath, but tour schedules and band infighting and drug problems and all of those kinds of things, intrusive bands, dealing with all of that when they're 23 or 24. And when I first started, my kids were about that age. And I thought, there's just no way that I can't imagine my daughter having to deal with a very wealthy and good looking and talented heroin addict, but that's the case for some of these women. And so the youth of the young age of most of them, and the young age of the men as well, and what expectations we had for them to continue a normal life when they have all of this attention and money and accolades and all of these things that will mess up your mind, will mess with your head a little bit. And so again, both people dealing with all of these things, that was a real eye-opener for me. I think the narrative, the idea that other people are creating and perpetuating certain narratives, and that the widows really have very little to do with that's a big theme throughout. And there's this idea that if a widow kind of stands her ground or has involved in any kind of legal issues, that they're gold diggers, that is an inherently female kind of portrayal, and it's not correct. And Catherine Mayer I interviewed her in London. She was married to Andy Gill, who was the founder of Gang of Four, a post-punk band that came out of the art school that several bands at that time came out of. But Andy was very bright and a wonderful musician, and then became a producer and worked with several artists. But Catherine had said, when you layer the misogyny of the music industry on top of the misogynistic framework of what it means to be a widow, it's really quite something. And that's, to me, one of the best quotes in the whole book. And it's so true that people see the widow as this helpless female. And as she went on to say, then, I'm going to fight for Andy, and I'm not doing it for money, and I'm not doing it for fun. I am doing it because of Andy, and I am going to make sure that his legacy is assured, that the work that he put into his music is there for people and is represented properly and all of those things. And it doesn't, people think this grief will cut your legs out from under you. It doesn't. It makes them stronger. It makes the person stronger, and they will fight. Judy Van Zandt is an excellent example of that as well.
One of the things I'm sitting here thinking is what's a shame is the idea that you're held to a double standard. The Barbie movie showed that so perfectly, right?
Mhm.
And the idea that you wanting to get, and I'm gonna be clumsy how I'm saying this, so forgive me, but you wanting the right share for you and your children, or just you, of the legacy of your husband's music, both financially. It is so wrong to be, you're just a gold digger. No, you guys are leeches. Everyone else is getting their piece of the pie. I actually loved and supported him. The other thing is the idea that the fans are like, no, how can you move on from your life? You're
Mhm.
like, I was under 30 when I lost him. I'm
Yeah,
supposed to spend my rest of my life. I will always mourn him, but
right.
I don't have the right to find a companion, someone I want to love and spend time with. And it's, oh, how can you be disloyal to his memory? And
Yes.
it is such an, if you're, oh, you're just a greedy witch. Oh, and now you're an uncaring witch. It just, you cannot win.
No, they
And
can't. They
yeah,
can't. Quite often, they really can't. I have one widow. So I did 24 interviews and 14 made it into the book. So I'm hoping that there will be a volume two. We'll see, depending on how this book does. But there are some additional interviews. And one of them, I won't say who, since she's not in the book, but
yeah,
her husband was also, he was here in the US. She took him back to the UK. He was British, and that's where he was buried with his family. He had children from his first marriage, and she was very magnanimous. He should be there where his children are. And so she did that. And it was the middle of winter. And so nothing could be done around his grave. You have to come back in the spring and take
yeah,
care of that. Then everybody you think would know that. But within days, fans are online saying what an uncaring person she is, how terrible it is that she left him in an unmarked grave. Like how it's just, and then what do? She can't engage. You can't
no,
engage.
you
And
can't.
so she has to just watch these comments come in, and it's very difficult, but quite often they're in this position where they really can't do anything right, regardless of what they do. And I will say there aren't that many of them that have remarried. And I don't interview Iman in my book, but if she's listening, I would love to do
Yeah,
that. But she has said, I've heard the quote from her many times where she says, people refer to David as my late husband. He's not, he's my husband. And I think of the kind of passionate stories, and I
yeah,
mean, they're rock stars. What do you do
yeah.
after that? And hopefully you find love again, but there's a really high bar, at that point.
So two other questions. The first, I would love to hear anything. Harry Chapin was someone I just adored. I was lucky enough to see him live once. It was just him on stage with his guitar, just telling stories and singing. And when you think of all the good he did, just so I'd love any story you want to share about Sandy.
Yes.
Okay.
It's just a lovely person, but also one who I think felt the weight of his legacy. And
Yeah.
he had started creating his legacy while he was still alive, with all of the over half of what he made, he gave away.
Yeah. One for
And
them, one for me. One for them, one for
yes,
me. Yeah.
yeah. And she felt compelled to really continue much of the work that he had been doing, and it became her life's work, in addition to their children who were
Yeah.
young. And it was a really wonderful, it was another, I would say, another kind of enlightening moment for me. As part of this, I had started going to cemeteries and seeing the graves and just paying my respects to the person as part of the interview that I would do. And Harry's grave is beautiful. They have this very large stone that they brought from upstate New York, from the family land that the Chapins had, and the brothers brought that down, and it's engraved. And there are little stones all around it. There's sometimes notes, not so much empty bottles. I've seen a lot of empty liquor bottles, but
Yeah.
people leave notes for Harry. People leave smaller stones there. And Sandy said that it's lovely, and I'm glad that there are people who still feel a connection to Harry and do that. But sometimes I go there and I just want to be alone with Harry. And it's another reminder that I never will just be alone with Harry. And so that was again, this kind of balance between fandom and humans, this very human interaction. And yeah, and I have repeated that story to several widows and they agree. Nancy Jones told the story of going to be with George at the cemetery and finding someone's ashes had been spread. And once again, I'll never deal with something like that. And you wonder
That's just,
how a fan could say, when I die, this is my wish, and not think that there's somebody else there that is going to be impacted by that. Again, this is something that they do have to deal with. And yeah, but Sandy is just lovely and really has worked so hard to maintain and keep Harry's legacy.
So the other question I wanted to ask, and we don't have to get into specifics because I certainly want people to read the book, but sometimes a marriage isn't a storybook, happy ending. And yet we often talk about when you lose someone and there's unfinished business. I was lucky. I lost my brother almost 2 years ago. February was 2 years ago. And he and I had a very strained relationship. And about 2 or 3 years before he got sick, we figured it out. We figured out how to be brothers and to be friends and to love each other. And so I did not have a sense of, man, what if?
Yeah.
But there has to be, and I'm reading a couple of blurbs, so I won't go specifics, but if you get in general terms, okay, you've already got the grief of you've lost a partner, even if it was a rough relationship, children, the image of legacy. And I think of The Sopranos, right? She was a saint when Olivia dies, and she's so far from a saint.
Right.
So that's a vague question, but help me out, Lori. You've done great.
Well,
Every time I've been vague, you've come up with great stories.
So I interviewed two women, I believe, I hope I'm not leaving anyone out, two women who were divorced from their partners, Crystal Zivan and Vera Ramon, who had been married to Dee Ramon and was divorced. And in both cases, I say that they really suffered loss twice. We suffer the loss of separation from someone and then this more permanent loss. And Crystal, I think, that is one of my favorite chapters because she talks so well about forgiveness. And Warren was physically abusive, so I'll give that much away. So she had a lot to forgive, and they divorced, but they stayed in touch. He would call her sometimes when he was lost and say, how do I get home from here? And he would call her when he had dated someone and then had a breakup. And so they remained in close touch, and he was given his diagnosis. And as you mentioned earlier, he did go into the studio and record one last album. He willed himself, she believes, to really stay alive until his grandsons were born. He wanted to be there for that. And then he told her kind of to write his biography after he was gone, and he left all of his journals to her, and she talks about, and actually, if you don't mind,
No,
I could
please.
read a quick, it'll take
I
me
would
just
love
a
that.
minute.
No, take your
It'll
time.
take just a minute to find it, but
I'd
it's
love
just
that.
such a lovely passage that he asked her to write this biography, and she agrees to do it. She says, so I write, Crystal kept her promise and told Warren's story in her New York Times bestseller, I'll Sleep When I'm Dead, The Dirty Life and Times of Warren Zevon. Through interviews with friends, musicians, family members, and even his girlfriends, Crystal pieced together the story of Warren's life, even the awful, ugly parts, as he had told her to do. Much of the book is based on detailed journals that Warren kept for much of his adult life. He wrote about the minutiae of his day, including things like a new type of mustard he tried on a sandwich. But he also wrote about his relationships, his sexual exploits, and his feelings about Crystal and their marriage. Reading his journals was hell, Crystal said. There were parts where he said wonderful things about me and the kids, but there were also many difficult parts. And he had this microscopic handwriting. She had to end up getting a large magnifying glass in order to read them. All the girlfriends were there. He was very sexual, but after our divorce, he really became an addict. He replaced alcohol with women. So where does forgiveness fit into Crystal and Warren's story, I ask? Was she able to forgive the abusive husband after their divorce, or at least by the time that he died? I've forgiven him several times, in fact, she responds. I think the fact that after we separated, I dove into studies looking at it from an intellectual perspective was something I needed to do. And then I had to deal with my own problems with alcohol, and the forgiveness became even more complete. So it was a huge revelation for me. It was a powerful moment for me to realize that I needed forgiveness, the power and the value and the importance of it in our lives. I think it allowed us to create a new life of friendship. But when he died, it was as though I had to go through it all over again. Reading his journals, there was a lot I didn't know about. I had new anger. People ask me what surprised me when I read them, and the truth is there wasn't much that surprised me. There weren't many things. What upset me was the prevalence. Things were much more deep-seated than I knew. I never would have cared to know the details of many of these things. It brought it all up again. I had to go through it again. It felt like him beating me up again, like getting punched in the face all over again. But when I was done, it was over. I would never have chosen to do it had he not asked me to. But now I'm so glad I did, because it was like Warren's one last confession, one last request for forgiveness. It allowed me to know and to forgive everything. And now I just really love him and miss him. I miss his voice on the phone, the chance meeting somewhere, or making plans to go out to lunch, or talking about what to give our daughter for her birthday. So a really lovely passage and an important lesson for all of us, that the forgiveness is for us as much as for the other person. So, and thinking about Vera Ramon as well, she had a difficult last conversation with Dee Dee, and he asked her to come back, and she said, I can't still live this lifestyle that we lived when we were 20. We're older now, and I can't do it. And she said he was calling her from a payphone, and he said, okay, goodbye, Vera. And that was it. That was the last time he talked with her. And so again, the loss happened twice. So it is difficult. It's a different kind of loss, but I think difficult both times.
So one of the most obvious questions I haven't asked yet is, what inspired you to use the title, to pick that title?
Do you know where it comes from?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So the title does come from Don McLean's American Pie. And the full line is the epigraph in the book. And the full line is, I can't remember if I cried when I read about his widowed bride. And that line is about Maria Elena Holly, the widow of Buddy Holly. So the person that I regard as the first rock widow.
Yes.
So yeah, I think it's inspired myself.
When I, pulling back the curtain, when this was posted on the Pantheon podcast, our internal boards, and I saw the title, I immediately knew what the book was about.
Yeah.
And yes, I think it is just amazing. And right before I had read about this, I actually got lucky enough to talk to Don McLean for about 20 minutes. He was promoting a appearance, and it was funny, Lori, because his publicist was like, you only have 20 minutes. You have to be careful. And I've got my little clock out, like, oh, I don't want to go over. I don't want to go over. So that's just lovely. So I'm I'm going to in a few minutes ask you how people can reach you and how can they find the book and ask you the Mary question. But before that, is there anything I should have asked you that I haven't, Lori?
I don't think so. That we've talked about the writing process and
Okay.
everything I've learned. Yeah. Yeah. It's
Okay.
been a great conversation.
Good. I hope you've had fun. I've had a blast. If someone wants to reach you, what's the best way?
So you can go to my website, LoriTuckerSullivan.com, and there are links to order the book there. It's readily available at bookstores or on bookshop.org is my preferred way to order online because that does benefit independent bookstores. It's available at that other store online too. So it's wherever you might want to go. And then on Instagram, I'm at Rock Widows. And also on Facebook, I can't remember if I cried. The Rock Widows book is on Facebook as well. So yeah, please join us there. I recognize lots of people on birthdays or anniversaries of their passing, and we put some trivia up and all kinds of stuff on the page. So yes, we'd love to engage.
Yeah, I will include all those links in the show notes. I end every podcast with the Mary question. And if you are a fan of Lori's work or you're a friend or family member and checking out, you should be very proud of her. She did herself very well. Jay Armstrong is a retired honors English professor, but when he was teaching, he would give the lyrics to the song Thunder Road to his high school seniors. And they were in an honors English class, and they would break it down as if it was a poem, discussing the imagery Bruce uses, using the themes. They would talk about the word usage, compare it to other American poets. And then at the end of the class, he would ask his students, does Mary get in the car? Lori, that is your question. Does Mary get in the car at the end of Thunder Road?
Gosh, it is a tough question. I listened to the song again today and I read the lyrics. I've already known the lyrics. And I do have to tell you, full disclosure, full transparency. I saw Bruce about 2 years ago, maybe when he was in Detroit.
Yeah.
It was my very first time seeing him. And it was if people would ask, who haven't you seen that regret? And Bruce's was up on that list. So I had to go. So it was a great.
And did you enjoy the show?
Oh, I did. Absolutely. Yeah. It was really wonderful. Went with a friend and we had a great time. And does she? I think the beauty of the song is that ambiguity.
And by the way, that is a fair answer. I've
Right.
had fair people say in fire, Brian Koppelman, who wrote Billions, was on the show, and he said that's the whole purpose of the song. You don't know. That's what makes the song great.
Yeah.
So if that's your answer, that's okay.
And he really is, he's pleading with her in the most poetic way.
Yes.
And we just don't know. And yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That is fine. I love that answer.
Okay.
That is great. Thank you so much. This has been so much fun. I can't remember if I cried. Rock Riddles on Life, Love, and Legacy, available wherever you find books. Please check it out. Let it know. This sounds amazing. I am really looking forward to reading it.
Great.
So I'm going to end with a Bruce song, and if you saw him recently, these are what he's ending his concert with. Okay. And the song is I'll See You in My Dreams, I'll see you in my dreams where all our summers have come to an end. I'll see you in my dreams, we'll meet and live and laugh again. I'll see you in my dreams, yeah, up around the river bend, for death is not the end, and I'll see you in my dreams. Thank you, Lori. Thank you, listeners. Jesse. Be safe, be kind, and we'll talk to you soon. Goodbye. Thank you for listening to Set Lusting Bruce. I hope you enjoyed our discussion of music, and I also hope you check out other episodes of the podcast. I've spent over 7 years talking to hundreds of music fans from around the world about the power and the magic of music. Please follow me on my socials. I'm still on Twitter, aka X, at Jesse Jackson DFW. The show is at Set Lusting Bruce. The show and I both still have a Facebook page. Please go there and like us. I'm part of a few other podcasts. On Perfectly Good Podcast, me and my co-host Sullivan are talking about every John Hyatt song in alphabetical order. Set Lustig Bruce and Perfectly Good Podcast are part of the Pantheon Podcast Network, where we have hundreds of shows dedicated to music. Please check them out. My good friend Charles and I talk all things Doctor Who on Next Stop Everywhere. Currently, I am part of the Small Council Matters podcast, where we are discussing the latest episode of House of the Dragon. And each week, Lou, Karen, and I talk about Babylon 5 and other pop culture topics on Last Best Hope for Conversation, part of the JKL Media podcast family. I would love to hear your feedback. Please send me an email at setlustingbruce@gmail.com. You can leave a voicemail, 469-249-2442. Give me your thoughts. Tell me what you like. Tell me what you dislike. Hook me up with someone you think would be a great guest. Getting to talk to people about music and other creative endeavors is my passion. And I hope that these conversations bring you a little joy, a little peace, and a whole lot of love. Thank you for listening,